Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to hear about our exciting new resource that we've created for Bee City and Bee Campus participants and the public at large. Um, just to kick things off, I'm going to just reintroduce Carly and everyone, just to make sure you guys know who we are, not just our faces. I'm Laura Rost. I'm the national coordinator of Bee City Bee Campus. Carly has been working part-time on Bee City Bee Campus and then part-time with the Xerces Ambassador Program as our community engagement assistant. Somewhere in the audience, we have Matthew Shepard, probably, who's our Director of Outreach and Education, who oversees Bee City Bee Campus and our Ambassador Program. And our guest of honor today is Aaron Anderson. He is the Xerces Society Pesticide Program Specialist. His focus is towns and cities. Aaron works with the public and Xerces staff to reduce pesticide use in residential landscapes, including promoting alternative pest control measures and pollinator-friendly gardening practices. Prior to joining Xerces in 2022, he researched pollinator conservation in urban landscapes, excuse me, restored habitat for several endangered butterfly species, and worked in insect biocontrol. In 2021, he was an AAAS Mass Media Fellow at the St. Louis Dispatch, where he reported science and business stories. Aaron has a PhD from Oregon State University, and outside of work, you can probably find him riding his bike, science writing, or fiddling with old cameras. Welcome, Aaron. Thank you so much. Everyone's probably a little familiar with Aaron's face. He's helped us with a number of webinars. But Aaron, if you want to go ahead and get your presentation queued up, I'll let you take it over once you get that going.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Laura. So let me just see if I can pull up my presentation here. Can you all see my presentation right now?
Yes. Great.
Okay, great. Let me just get my presenter mute mode up here.
All
All
right.
right. That looks okay for everybody?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Laura and Carly. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Laura said, my name's Aaron. I'm on the Xerces pesticide reduction team. Yeah, I work a lot in residential landscapes, as Laura said, promoting pesticide reduction and alternative pest management practices, in general, pollinator-friendly gardening practices. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about our IPM Toolkit launch. I think these are going to be some really great resources for affiliates and, as Laura said, for the public at large. Okay, so yeah, let's dive in. So, I guess the meat of this presentation is sharing our new IPM resources with you. But before we talk about the new resources, I want to do a little bit of review on the risks that pesticides pose to pollinators and other invertebrates, why IPM matters, and a little bit just about what IPM is, just to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we'll share some examples as well of affiliates who I think are doing great work and some fun, inspiring statistics about affiliates who are reducing pesticide use in their communities. And yeah, so let's dive in and talk a little bit about ecologically based integrated pest management. So first, I guess the question is why IPM, right? So there's a lot of reasons, but let's focus on insects and pollinators, since you all are Bee City USA affiliates who are committed to protecting bees and other pollinators in your communities and campuses. So most of you are likely already aware of this, but many recent studies are documenting declines in insect populations and communities worldwide. In particular, many pollinators, including bees and butterflies, are imperiled. And the data is patchy since many insects, in fact, most insects, aren't carefully monitored. But the data that we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve pollinators and other insects. And you might ask what's causing these declines, and there's several major drivers that scientists agree on, but two are directly related to, I think what you are doing as Bee City USA affiliates. Habitat loss is a major factor, largely due to agricultural expansion and urbanization. So the habitat creation that you all are doing in your communities and campuses is a really wonderful thing to kind of combat that. But 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used each year in the United States, and this use is also a major driver of of insect declines. Bee kills from pesticides have been widely reported, but even when pesticide use doesn't kill pollinators, most pesticides also cause subtle negative effects that can slowly result in population declines. So any pesticide use, even in our towns and cities and campuses, can really have far-ranging unintended consequences. I also want to stress that most insects aren't pests. The vast majority of insect species are great. They're directly beneficial to humans or are otherwise foundational to our ecosystems. One statistic that I've read is that less than 2% of described species are what we might consider pests. And even those can be beneficial because many pest species are the food source for other insects, and some low level of pests support natural enemies like predators, like ladybugs, and parasitoid wasps, things that help control pests. But we still commonly use pesticides on all of these organisms, and many of the chemicals we use for insect, disease, and weed management are harmful to more than just their target species. And I have a Rachel Carson quote here on the slide, yet most of the chemicals now used to kill all insects are friends and enemies alike. So a really good but depressing case study of how pesticide use in cities and towns can have far-ranging and unintended consequences took place in 2013, when over 50,000 bumblebees were poisoned in a shopping center parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon, shown here on this slide. All those little black dots, unfortunately, on the ground there are dead bumblebees. This application that killed them was made to parking lot trees. The application was aimed at killing aphids that were dripping honeydew, that sticky substance that sometimes you get on your car when you're parked underneath a tree. These linden trees were flowering, which means when applicators sprayed the toxic neonicotinoids to kill the aphids, they also sprayed all these bees that were visiting the flowers of the trees. And other insects like honeybees and lady beetles were also killed in this application. Of course, the applicators didn't mean to kill all of these bees, but it's a good example of recognizing that when we apply a pesticide, there can be very large unintended consequences. And I also think this is a stark reminder that it doesn't matter how high quality the habitat that we create in cities and towns and campuses is, if pollinators aren't protected from pesticide applications like this one. I hope this also kind of helps get at that question of, do we even need to think about ecology if it's in a highly developed park, or in the case on this slide, a parking lot in a suburban mall? And the answer is yes, because there's a lot more living there and using these areas as habitat than you might, realize when you first look at them.
I just wanted to jump in real quick and say if anyone wants more information on how the city of Wilsonville chose to respond to this private landowner issue where these trees were sprayed, we have a great webinar featuring staff from city of Wilsonville, their Bee City. Carrie did a great presentation with us called Turning Lemons into Lemonade that is available on our YouTube channel. Because again, this was not a city pesticide spray. This was private landowners, and they did a wonderful job of changing practices citywide to try to compensate for this event.
That's a great point, Laura. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, wasn't trying to say the city of Wilsonville themselves. And yeah, and Carrie has done, the presentation is really great, and I encourage all of you to check it out. And kind of the great work they've all been doing. Yeah, no, thank you for that, Laura. So I also want to stress that we are concerned about more than these high-profile BDIFs or applications that, kind of kill beneficial insects directly. Our landscapes often have background contamination, which might not be high enough to kill an organism directly, but they still cause subtle yet harmful effects. And we call these sublethal effects. So a sublethal effect is anything short of death, like decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in an insect's ability to learn, things like this. So many of these impacts might reduce a bee's or other insects' abilities to reproduce or gather food for their offspring. So even though the individual might not be killed, these small effects can add up at the population level as the insects are less able to reproduce. I want to note that there are risks from more than just insecticides, which obviously are designed to kill insects. Some fungicides have been linked with these subtle yet harmful impacts. An example is that symptoms resembling malnutrition were noted in honeybees after exposure to some fungicides. And other types of fungicides interact synergistically with certain insecticides, which means they actually increase the toxicity of these insecticides to bees when they're present together. And the main impact of herbicides is that they remove flowering plants from the landscape, which provide the pollen and nectar that bees and other insects rely on for food. But there are also some studies that suggest that glyphosate might actually impact bees' abilities to navigate and also interfere with bees' gut microbiomes and make them more susceptible to disease. And I do want to note that similar issues have been found with some other herbicides. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as just switching away from glyphosate, for example. Anyway, I just wanted to do a quick digression there to emphasize that these sublethal impacts can happen from a variety of sources. So I want to give you a quick kind of idea of why this matters, and it includes some data from a study that we actually performed here at Xerces. So we know that from studies that there's often these background levels of contamination across different landscapes. But we don't know a lot of the specifics of what different types of pesticide contamination are common in various urban areas. And as we're encouraging people and communities to create more pollinator habitat, we want to make sure that we understand the risks that might be present to invertebrates in these habitats. So in the summer of 2022, we conducted a butterfly host plant sampling project. We sampled butterfly host plants in home yards, city parks, and also city natural areas in Sacramento, California, and Albuquerque, New Mexico. So butterfly host plants are the plants that larval butterflies, caterpillars, feed on, and often they need a specific host plant or genus. Monarchs and milkweeds are a great example of that. So we selected both herbaceous plants. We had a variety of things like lupins and plantains, and also woody plants, including oaks, willows, cottonwoods. And we clipped leaves from these plants, like in that photo in the center there of some willow leaves. And then we overnight shipped them to a lab where they were analyzed for various pesticide residues. And overall, we found evidence of this widespread background contamination that we were just talking about being common in these residential landscapes. We found 47 compounds detected overall, 14 insecticides, 10 herbicides, and 20 fungicides. Oops. So for Sacramento, we found about 5.5 compounds per sample, and we found contamination on 94% of the samples that we collected. We found azoxystrobin in 84% of the samples, which is a fungicide. And then we found methoxyphenicide in 78% of the samples. And this is an insecticide that's used against Lepidoptera pests, and Lepidoptera is the group name for butterflies and moths. And this is particularly concerning because all of these plants that we sampled were butterfly host plants, and the caterpillars eat. And if 78% of the samples we collected had this insecticide present, that's pretty eye-opening as far as the ubiquitousness, at least in Sacramento, of this one pesticide. In Albuquerque, we had just over 2.5 compounds per sample, but there were pesticides detected at 92% of the sites we sampled. We found atrazine in 70% of the samples. This is a restricted use herbicide that's pretty long lasting in the environment, and it can actually synergize the toxicity of some insecticides. Again, it can make certain insecticides more toxic than they would be normally. So I just wanted to share these examples to highlight why we're concerned with routine pesticide use and why we encourage ecologically based IPM to protect pollinators. Okay, so let's move on to actually talking about IPM. So again, to help protect pollinators and other beneficial insects and reduce that background contamination, we really encourage affiliates to adopt ecologically based IPM plans, or as you might be familiar with, IPPM, that's Integrated Pest and Pollinator Management. Though this might be review for many of you, I just wanted to kind of dive in and talk about what this means and a little bit about the principles and methods behind this concept before talking about our new resources. I think this is also good review just because different organizations and industries sometimes use the term IPM differently. So this is, kind of what we're talking about when we talk about IPM. So here are some definitions of IPM. We kind of like all of these. We like using the term ecologically based IPM frequently. Yeah, there's various kind of different ways to define it, but all three of these definitions are ones that we like. So one is, a comprehensive approach to solving pest problems that focuses on the big picture. Instead of simply trying to eliminate a pest, IPM involves changing factors that favor pests while using safer, less toxic methods that are effective and environmentally sound. That's from the city of Pasadena. From our website, IPM emphasizes prevention first and seeks to eliminate the underlying causes of plant diseases, weeds, and insect problems, rather than relying on the routine use of pesticides. And then from University of California IPM, we have IPM is a pest management strategy that focuses on long-term prevention or suppression of pest problems with minimum impact on human health, the environment, and non-target organisms. Okay, so let's quickly boil IPM down a little bit into the three main principles, or as we often share with this image, three legs of a stool that you can kind of think about when minimizing pesticide reliance. So the first is prevention. So this is about addressing the root causes of pest issues, with non-chemical approaches. So these are things like keeping the system healthier by eliminating the conditions that favor pests, things like ensuring plants are properly watered, that you have correct soil pH and nutrition, you're using appropriate plant species, things like this. You're trying to reduce the stressors that can lead to pest populations really increasing. And this is also all about those non-chemical strategies as well. So things like mechanical control or physical disruption of the pest also fit into this category. The second principle is monitoring or assessing pest pressure, and it's about identifying what pests are actually in your landscape, and if the populations and pressure even warrant any type of intervention, including up to the use of pesticides. This means observing and tracking pest pressure regularly, and it also helps you see if those non-chemical prevention methods that you're using are actually working, and if you can continue managing the pest with these low impact methods. Thinking about pest pressure in your IPM plan is really key for reducing your reliance on pesticides because you're kind of constantly evaluating and making choices about when and where a pest is enough of a problem to need some sort of management or again, even to justify the use of a pesticide. And we really encourage people to set thresholds for pests below which action doesn't need to be taken. And then finally, in some cases, there may be pests that defy preventative management and non-chemical control methods and move above those tolerable levels. And while we certainly don't encourage the use of pesticides and actually, really celebrate when affiliates, eliminate the use of pesticides, if someone is going to apply a pesticide, then it really is important to understand how to limit harm by reducing the risk of exposure and by using pesticides with lower toxicity. So these are kind of the three principles we talk about a lot. And again, like the stool kind of being supported by the three legs, this is kind of a framework that can help reduce reliance on pesticides and help protect pollinators and people. And I also want to note that, when we talk about IPM, we're not just talking about substituting, good pesticides or chemicals for, good ones for bad ones. Sometimes people think that substituting a newer product that's hyped as being greener is what IPM is about. And that's not the approach that we're recommending here, at least not exclusively. So zooming in a little bit on these legs of the school and kind of stool and talking about them in more detail, prevention is basically the use of these maintenance strategies to keep the landscape healthy and in good condition. Or if this is indoors, ways of keeping the building less susceptible to pests. And this can include all sorts of pest management practices, many of which you or your communities are likely already doing. For example, the principle of just choosing the right plant for the right place. We often recommend native, adapted, low maintenance plants is a great primary prevention tool. Taking care of your soil, using compost or mulch appropriately, or if you're going to use a fertilizer, using a slow release fertilizer, avoiding soil compaction, erosion, disturbance, things like that to kind of keep things in a way that the weeds won't invade. Sanitation is also an important prevention strategy, which means making sure you dispose of weed seed heads and other propagules, diseased tissue in ways that won't lead to further spread. And I do want to note that when it comes to invasives and emerging pests, we do always recommend consulting local experts for specific prevention practices. So the next leg of the stool is monitoring, and this is about knowing what pests are in your system, what habitats they're occupying, tracking the level of pressure, things like that, trying to understand if that pressure is at a point where intervention is needed. So this requires staff that can identify weeds and insects and diseases and understand their life cycle, or having the resources available and access to an expert who can help identify these things. This can include a lot of items. It's often about, doing inspections to note the presence and abundance of pests. We have some examples on this slide, like dragging for ticks in a grassy area, using sticky bands to monitor for spotted lantern flies, and then simply just looking at the backside of leaves for the presence of pests, like aphids, for example. Monitoring is also looking for pest-conducive conditions. So things like testing soil chemistry or biology on an athletic field, for example, or monitoring for mosquitoes for your mosquito management plan. So doing this step, although it seems like a lot of work, is really important to reducing pesticide reliance and can actually in the long term often help save on costs and unnecessary ecological damage by reducing these pesticides in your system. And I do want to note too that, I'd like to share this image a lot, is that not every sign of damage on a plant is a sign of something concerning. This photo, you have these little discs cut out of the leaf, but it's not a pest. These circular holes are actually cut by a leaf cutter bee, which is a type of native bee that uses these small pieces of leaf to line their nest with, which I think is really cool. They're one of my favorite bees. Okay, so finally, we also want to limit pesticide harm. And I do want to be clear that the best way to limit pesticide harm is to switch away from pesticides towards non-chemical methods wherever you can. And, there are some affiliates who have done this entirely, which we can talk about later, which I think is really exciting. But thinking about these other methods, when and where you'll be using pesticides, have protocols in place to choose substances that are less toxic and apply them in ways that will reduce the exposure to bees, people, pets, things like that. So some tips that we recommend include no spray zones. So a lot of cities have, pesticide-free parks, for example. And you can also have warning systems like signs and even advanced notification like automated, text to people who sign up for alerts. Pollinators obviously can't be alerted in advance. So one way to, avoid impacting pollinators is to avoid applications to flowering plants, not use soil application where nesting can be occurring, and to, of course, avoid systemic pesticide use. And designating intentional pollinator habitat plantings as a place with no spray zones is also something we would encourage. And another way to limit harm is to, stop routine hidden pesticide uses, such as, combination fertilizer and pesticide products that are, applied, on athletic fields, for example. And then also, wherever possible, using lower toxicity products, insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils, for example, and using targeted treatments. So if you can, find a product that's targeted towards the pest as much as possible and use the product in the lowest effective dose and in as small of an area as possible. Okay, so now that we've kind of done that IPM review and grounding, thank you for all for following along. And again, for those of you, especially who might be associated with the IPM programs with your city or campus, that this might be a review for you. But yeah, for affiliates just starting out on their IPM plan or journeys, and those who are looking to continually improve their plans, where do you dive in? We've gotten, these types of questions a lot from affiliates, which kind of prompted us to create these toolkits to kind of help provide guidance and resources for affiliates. So our new toolkit involves an explanatory page that kind of talks about what IPM is, has some definitions, and kind of talks about plans more broadly. And then we have an IPM checklist that we've broken down kind of by section. It includes a lot of the elements that we would ideally love to see in an ecologically based IPM plan that protects pollinators. And then we have a page with some really great examples. This doesn't have a prescriptive way to take care of certain pests or specific monitoring thresholds. These are all things that are, of course, very location and context specific and need to be balanced with, affiliates' individual needs. But hopefully these resources can help provide the framework of what to build on for yourselves. And we can, of course, help provide suggestions and connect you with resources as you're building out or improving your IPM plans. Okay, so the core of our new resource is this IPM checklist. And let me see if I can move to a different page where I can actually scroll. Oops. Is that actually moving right now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Laura. I embedded the website into the slide and I was hoping it would work. So we have this IPM checklist. And it's live on the site, and as Laura was saying, it's also available for anybody in the public, not just affiliates. We really want to share this widely. So please feel free to share with anybody you think would be interested. And we talk about some of the main IPM elements that we would really like to see in IPM plans. We talk about monitoring with some suggestions. We talk about that non-chemical prevention and management and different considerations. We talk about that pesticide use and risk reduction. And we also talk about administration, so things like maintaining a reference library of strategies, keeping records of pest scouting, talking about training, communicating expectation, things like that, because often the success of IPM plans also hinges on things like administration and then also community outreach, providing ongoing education and information for the public is a really great way to build community support. So we have some information on that, and then also further reading. And these are all live on the website, so all of you can kind of peruse these at your own leisure. And then we also have a PDF version of this that actually does have checkboxes, so you can go through and check things off as you are interested. So then this is kind of the plan that has some explanatory it's kind of more of an explanatory landing page talking about developing your IPM plan. So we kind of talk about what ecologically responsible IPM is, talk about the things we like to see under this comprehensive and verifiable IPM plan. Oops, I jumped ahead there. The components we like to see, things we're encouraging practitioners to do. Again, talking a little bit about record keeping and training and resources, and then again, some more further reading. And then we have an example page. So one of the things that we kind of often get questions on is whether there's good examples of plans. And this is one of those things that can be really tricky because things can, depending on the plan, be a little bit location specific and things like that. But we tried to find some great plans that really hit a lot of the check boxes that we were looking for things that are, good to include in an ecologically minded IPM plan. And we're kind of broadly applicable. So we have, Eugene, Oregon, which is a smaller size city, San Francisco, which is, an example of a larger size city. And then we also have some B campus affiliates, Blue Ridge Community College, Lane Community College, and Portland Community College, all which have some really good, IPM plan components and are great examples for perhaps an affiliate who's looking to start their plan or for one who's looking to kind of build their plan out and wants an example of what some real world plans that are great look like. We also have some B-City USA IPM case studies of just some good examples of actions that that affiliates have taken kind of in the IPM realm, and we'll talk about a few of these on the next slides. And we also have some B-City USA successes. So just some statistics that I find pretty inspiring about what B-Cities and campuses have done to kind of reduce pesticide risk in their communities. And again, we'll talk more about that in a couple slides. And I'll see if I can go back to my other screen here. Okay. Oh, and I see somebody has raised a hand. Oh, the hand went away. Okay. Never mind. I was just wondered if somebody had a question. Okay, we'll have time for questions at the end. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight a couple affiliates who have been doing great pesticide reduction work, and there's a lot of affiliates that have been doing great work, but it just picked a couple cool examples here that I think were kind of creative non-chemical management. So first we have Pittman Center, Tennessee, and they had an area that was overrun by a monoculture of invasive kudzu, and this was overrunning their landscaping and also was serving as a fire risk. But instead of using chemicals to control it, they ended up using a herd of goats to eat the weeds. And you can see the goats on the hillside right there, munching away on the kudzu. So by doing this, they ended up avoiding using toxic pesticides, which is great. You can see this is what the area looked like afterwards, showing the aftermath and how successful it was. And then by doing this, native plants like this yellow trillium and purple phacelia ended up growing in the newly cleared area, and they were able to do this without using toxic pesticides, which is pretty cool. So I think this is a great example of how, a little bit of patience and kind of thinking outside the box can, really have a wonderful result. So another example here is University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and they use some funds to purchase a steam weeder, which kind of functions similarly to a flame weeder, but it superheats water to about 250 degrees, and then it bursts plant cells without frying the kind of mulch and soil like flame weeders do. And you can see this person here who's operating the steam weeder. And then it leaves behind, of course, pesticide-free mulch in the form of these dead plants for soil organisms to decompose. So it kind of is a win-win situation for controlling weeds. And then University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, with other IPM measures that they're doing over the last few years, have reduced their pesticide use by about 90%, which I find really inspiring. I think that's just really wonderful. So yeah, I also, as an example, wanted to share some of these great statistics of steps that B-City USA affiliates and Campus USA affiliates have taken to protect pollinators via their IPM work, hopefully to serve as some inspiration, because I know this really does serve as an inspiration for me. It's really exciting to see people on the ground doing this work in the real world, reducing pesticide use, because that's really, really the goal. So 45 affiliates have eliminated pesticide applications solely to maintain aesthetics on their campus or city grounds, which is something we've included in this checklist as a great goal, is to try to eliminate those cosmetic uses and only try to manage a pest when it really is kind of an economic threat. 34 affiliates have restricted pesticide use to only organic approved products, which aren't always, but tend to be much less toxic than conventional insecticide and herbicide products. 77 affiliates only use pesticides as a last resort within their IPM plan. 150 affiliates have avoided the use of pesticides in public sites containing those designated pollinator habitats or other sensitive features, which is a great way to protect pollinators. Uh, 88 affiliates implemented non-chemical pest prevention and management methods on their city or campus grounds, and 49 affiliates sourced plants for city or campus grounds using buying Be Safe Plants methods recommended by the Xerces Society. And if anybody has questions about that, we have web pages and fact sheets and resources about that. Often nursery plants have high levels of pesticide contamination because of the demand for plants to be, aesthetically pleasing and damage-free, as well as there's some interstate regulations regarding, pest transfer that leads to a lot of pesticide use in nursery production. So we have some resources to help guide how to make sure you're buying plants that are bee safe when you're adding landscaping to your campus or to your community. And then 10 affiliates reported to us that they had eliminated pesticide use altogether on their city or campus grounds as of 23, which I think is really, really inspiring. So here's some great examples of things that Bee City and campus affiliates have been doing. So I want to end by stressing that affiliates aren't expected to adopt all of these elements that are in our toolkit and our checklist immediately. We certainly recognize this is a journey that can kind of take time as you're working through the nuances of your own plan and the needs and demands of your own communities and campuses. But I want you to please feel free to reach out to us with questions and feedback. Laura can provide some more feedback, I'm sure, on what we're looking for on like a year-to-year basis from affiliates, and our team is certainly excited to help you all out in any way we can, from providing feedback on plans to providing support, helping you know what we're looking for and linking you up with resources that can kind of help you in your process. So with that, we have the pesticides@xerces.org email as well as the Bee City one, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Erin. This was wonderful. And yes, we're here to support you. This is our new kit, so please let us know if there's some key thing that you're all wanting from us. But we're excited to finally have this resource available both for Bee Cities and Bee Campuses and the public at large. And will be a dynamic kit. We'll keep adding resources as we learn more and have new ideas of how to help. But please feel free to share these links and this resource. We really want people to think about IPM both in terms of if they're managing habitat within their city or campus, and if they're just grassroots citizens that want to get involved. Anyone can really utilize this kit. Erin's been working on this idea for about basically since he started. We've been talking about this and brainstorming it. So we're very excited to share this with you. I'll let Carly take over with the questions. We got lots of chat and Q&A inquiries, so I'll let Carly take over.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Laura, and thank you again, Erin, for that wonderful presentation. Looks like we do have a few lingering questions. The first one's from Rosalind. Hi, Rosalind. Thanks for joining today. She's wondering, in the butterfly host plant sampling, so back to the study that you were talking about, was it possible to say if trees growing where these pesticides had not been directly used still picked it up indirectly and so had residues?
Yeah, Rosalind, that is a really great question and something that we're kind of looking at as we're kind of analyzing our data. So we're unfortunately unable to get pesticide use data for all of the parks and landscapes that we sampled in, but some of these samples were collected in areas like home yards where the homeowners claimed that they had not used pesticides. We also detected certain pesticides that are pretty much only used in agricultural production, and they wouldn't be used normally in a park setting or certainly not a home setting. So we were detecting those pesticides that the only explanation for why we were finding them is that they had been drifting or had been, going through the irrigation water, somehow moving off-site from agricultural use to, these urban areas. So yeah, so there definitely were pesticides that we were detecting that were not from direct applications on the site. So I think that's another thing, when I talk about pesticide use and kind of some of those unintended consequences, that's something that we like to kind of remind people is that pesticides often are very mobile and they don't stay right where we apply them. And there can be, wide-ranging implications for landscapes beyond, your park, your yard, wherever that site might be. Yeah, so definitely something we're looking at and that's of concern. I hope that answers the question.
I think that was a very detailed answer. Thank you, Aaron. And that was also a great question, Rosalind. So thank you. Beverly is wondering if a steam weeder could be used for Asian jumping worm control. Do you know if it would penetrate deeply enough?
I don't. I would probably caution against trying to use, something that's designed for killing weeds that's up on the surface, for trying to kill organisms, in the soil. Also, if it did kill, Asian jumping worm, it would also kill lots of other beneficial insects and organisms in the soil as well, even like soil microbes. So I don't know the answer to that offhand, but I'd probably encourage you to, use it as the manufacturer probably designs it for.
Good point. Thank you, Aaron. Chris is wondering if you have any anecdotes about the urban-rural interface or farmer involvement.
Oh, that's a great question. I can, if you want to send an email to that pesticides@xerces.org email, I can look for some more specific case studies for you. I'm not sure, maybe Laura and I can put our heads together and see if there's some Bee City examples. And then, I don't work often with farmers, but I have colleagues who do, and they might have some examples of kind of that kind of farmer community interface and stories about successes there. So definitely happy to look that up for you.
Great. And he had a follow-up question that I'm sure the same answer would apply. He's also asking about studies showing ROI on using an IPM with other sustainable land practices versus baseline/conventional approaches.
Yeah, if you want to send, I know we do have some resources, and I can try to pull those up. I know Sharon, I think, who has worked with IPM stuff previously on our team, has, I think, some information on that. So yeah, please send an email to that to that pesticides@xerces.org email, and we can try and get you some examples.
Great, awesome, thank you. And then David is wondering, this is a question for maybe beyond just Aaron, maybe Laura, maybe even Matthew, if he wants to raise his hand, we can unmute him. But how are the Xerces folks on the call feeling about the Saving America's Pollinators Act?
I don't have much detail on it. Aaron, do you have any thoughts on it?
I don't offhand. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, other than I know that it's out there.
Yeah, Matthew, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, let me unmute him really quick. Let's see. I think he still might have to unmute himself.
Yeah, I just saw that pop up. Sorry. I also just quickly Googled Saving America's Pollinators Act because I'm not quite sure what it covers. I wouldn't. I can't give a direct answer because I don't know the act. I wouldn't be too surprised if we were involved in some way with it. I believe Congressman Representative Blumenauer was involved with it, and we've worked with Blumenauer over the years because he's Portland, where our main office is. He's the representative for that area, but without looking into it more, I can't give a direct answer.
Yeah, and I know it involves prohibiting unregistered uses of pesticides and things like that, but I think I'm not as familiar about the nuances with it. We do have people on our team. We have somebody who actually just Rosemary moved from the pesticide team, the director of policy at Xerces. I'm sure that Rosemary is, much more tapped into this, but it's not a realm that I, kind of am diving into on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, just from looking at a very quick like basically a press release from Blumenauer I'm looking at here. It says, suspends the use of neonicotinoids and other pesticides harmful to bees and other pollinators. I mean, it seems like the kind of thing that we would be encouraging, right?
Yeah,
But there's always more nuance behind anything like that. So
exactly. Right. Right.
Great, thank you both. And I think someone might have posted the link in the chat as well, if anyone wants to look at that more. Carl was wondering, how well does IPM work with monocultures?
That's a good question. So, in a campus and town setting, I'm kind of imagining a monoculture of like many different flowers or grass or something like that. I know obviously for agriculture, this is kind of outside of our conversation here, looking at, a single crop. But in general, the more diverse your plantings are, the more robust they are to pest pressure, because you support more beneficial insects, and you can they kind of help control those pest populations. There's been studies done, and I think it was like I think it was something like well over 3/4 of the studies that were looked at, having these diverse plantings really increases the population of these beneficial insects, things that are, helping keep those pest populations and that pest pressure in check. So not to say you can't use IPM and IPM principles on kind of a more monoculture type setting, but the more diverse your habitat plantings are, your landscaping is, the less chance that you're going to have to use some of those other mechanical, physical, and then up to chemical management practices.
Great, thank you so much. This one from Courtney is more directed at the group of affiliates. So I think what I'll do is read it, and then folks can raise their hand while they're thinking about it if they have a response, and then I'll move on to the next one for Aaron. Aaron, if you have something to say about this, you're welcome to chime in as well. But Courtney's asking, unfortunately, switching to an organic fertilizer plan would be 3 times the cost. And TruGreen, who we contact for landscaping, only puts down its own proprietary fertilizer. So we can't use something like recycled Bay State fertilizer from MWRA. We would be interested in how folks with similar barriers overcome this. So that's could start a discussion. The group wants to think about that, and raise your hand if you have anything to add to that. I think
in the meantime, if we'll give that a second, I'll just say, Aaron, would you be able to make this presentation available as a PDF? We've had a number of people request PDF.
Yeah, sure. Totally. We can do that.
Great. And we can email that out to the group. And then I'll also put that in the next e-newsletter, Bee City e-newsletter, which will be going out, I believe it'll be next week, Thursday. So we'll make sure that you guys have access to that.
All right, awesome. Thank you. So it looks like a few answers are coming into the chat too to Courtney's question, if folks want to check that out. I have a specific question. What do you recommend for buckthorn all over our college campus where goats are unfortunately not an option?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't have a specific recommendation for buckthorn. It's not something that, I've personally dealt with. And lots of times these specific pest and weed issues can be really kind of location and context specific. But I would recommend where you are, we frequently recommend people contact their university extension office that often has, really good local resources for how to deal with some of these pests. Though I will note that, often extension does also, promote pesticide solutions. Not that that can't be the solution if it has to be, but maybe as you're asking the question, see if there's ways that they suggest for non-chemical management of buckthorn. Yeah, that would be my first recommendation. And if that fails, again, feel free to email us and we can, dive in and see if we can find any other resources for you, based kind of on where you are.
Great. Okay. And then it looks like Mary has her hand raised, might be a response to Courtney or might be her own question. So I'm going to let her talk here.
All right, Mary, if you unmute, we should be able to hear you.
Sorry. As a certified master gardener, my go-to compost that's organic and quick and fast are alfalfa pellets for horses. I do not have sorghum, and I buy the sorghumless, and this has been just amazing. Great to retain the water, great to put the organics back into the soil, quick and easy if you don't have a compost.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, this one is more of a general one. Laura is wondering, her community has had a lot of trouble with yellow jacket wasps recently. Everyone went immediately for toxic sprays readily available on local store shelves. I personally know there are non-toxic ways to discourage yellow jacket nests. And Aaron, being the expert resource here, do you have any suggestions for dealing with yellow jackets?
Yeah, that's a great question, Laura. We definitely do get a lot of questions about yellow jackets since they can, certainly be such a nuisance. I think what I would first recommend is just making sure that, at each specific location where there's, a yellow jacket issue, just identifying to make sure that it actually is a yellow jacket or a hornet or something like that, and not something like a paper wasp. Often people see those paper wasp nests and kind of get scared, even though paper wasps tend to be pretty docile and non-aggressive. Obviously, if it's someplace like a doorway where there's a lot of human traffic, you might have to deal with them there. But often, just seeing a paper wasp nest, you can kind of, I remember once, I had one on the rail of my garden, and I would just go out there and garden, and the paper wasp would just go to and fro and never bothered me. But when it is, truly a yellow jacket and there is, an issue there, we first recommend sanitation. So this is just making sure you're not leaving out food, not leaving out beverages for them to snack on and drink from, making sure the lids to trash cans are closed, because even if you don't have a nest on your property, if you have those kind of conducive environments and the food that they're looking for, they're still going to come into your yard. We recommend in some of these kind of more high traffic locations, having a professional remove the nest early in the season, without using chemicals. And then something else to kind of discourage nesting is yellow jackets tend to nest in old rodent holes. They nest in the ground. So in the late fall or winter, when all of the workers have died, you can go around the property and try to kind of squish and depress all of those kind of rodent holes that you might find to discourage nesting in subsequent years. And something else too to keep in mind is that yellow jackets don't reuse the same nesting spot each year or year after year. They find new ones. So a place that you had an issue one year, you might not have an issue there the next year. So those are some of the suggestions that we make, and just trying to, again, make sure there's nothing for the yellow jackets to feed on in your yard. And then, sometimes people use trapping. Trapping can be effective early in the season when you're trapping like the queens. In the middle of the season when it's mostly workers, unless it's something like you're having a big festival. I think I can, if you want to send me an email, I can find the link. Cornell University Extension did some research, and they found that, you really want to do that just kind of like the week before something. But one issue is that you can potentially be drawing more yellow jackets in to the area. So there's like a little bit of nuance to when you want to use the traps. I'm kind of rambling a little bit here, but hopefully some of that information was moderately useful.
That's all great. Thank you so much, Aaron. H is wondering, based on your studies and just prior knowledge, do you have any idea of how far mosquito controls contaminate other yards with a gentle breeze, how far they can travel?
Yeah, that's a great.
Real quick, just before you answer, I just wanted to say we have 5 minutes left in the hour, but we have plenty of time to answer questions. But if you need to drop off, we understand. This will be recorded and posted on our YouTube playlist, the Xerces YouTube channel under the Bee City playlist. And I will put this out in our e-newsletter next week on Thursday as well. But feel free to reach out if you need to email us questions. You're welcome to do so. Otherwise, we'll stick around for about a half hour and continue to answer questions. sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so that's a great question. And not to go on another ramble about Xerces sampling projects, but actually the next summer in 2023, just last summer, we did another sampling project looking at mosquito sprays and the risk that these residential mosquito sprays pose to bees and other pollinators. And, you know, I want to mention really quickly, there's two main types of residential mosquito sprays. So there's the barrier sprays that people, you know, when they hire a private company to come to their yard to spray for mosquitoes, these tend to be larger droplets that don't travel as far, and they're designed to kind of coat the vegetation to kill mosquitoes that are roosting in the vegetation, but then also to coat the vegetation with a barrier of these pyrethroids, which are highly toxic to all sorts of insects. And then there's also the municipal control district or vector control district sprays, which are designed to kind of aerosolize and make really small particles or really small droplet sizes of pesticides that can kind of hang in the air and float and disperse much farther. So those municipal control district sprays can travel for hundreds of yards sometimes, depending on the wind and things like that. For the barrier sprays, they don't travel as far, but because again, those droplet sizes are larger, so they kind of fall quicker than the ones with the really small droplet sizes. But in our studies, we were looking at both, how much residue was deposited by these sprays in the yards that were actively being sprayed, but then also how much residue drifted to neighbors' yards. And we found, detectable residues, sometimes at concerning levels in adjacent yards, as well as yards, that were a couple houses down or across a street, for example. So there's certainly some risk to neighboring yards from these mosquito sprays. So if your neighbor does spray for mosquitoes, we're not at all saying not to create pollinator habitat. More habitat's better, and in many cases these contamination levels weren't they're all concerning. I don't want to say weren't at concerning levels, but weren't at acutely lethal levels. But I think it's one of those things that if your neighbor does spray, if you feel comfortable trying to talk to your neighbor, or potentially using some mitigation strategies like planting a non-flowering barrier of shrubs like arborvitae that can kind of serve as a drift barrier and capture some of those sprays before they drift into your yard. So yeah, those are some of the kind of solutions to kind of try to help mitigate some of that drift from those residential mosquito sprays.
Great, awesome. That was a lot of information, Aaron. Appreciate it. Phyllis is here today. Hi, Phyllis. All right, when I said that, my screen shifted off of her question. Okay, so is Xerces, even I know the answer to this one, but is Xerces working with government agencies to disseminate ecologically based pest and pollinator IPM like NRCS?
Well, Carly, if you or Laura want to take this one, feel free to. Yeah.
I know that the answer is yes. I know that we work with NRCS.
Yes.
The exact, I know that we have biologists that are partner biologists with NRCS that work for Xerces, but beyond that.
Totally.
Yeah, Xerces staff has a really strong partnership with the USDA's NRCS program, which is a Natural Resources Conservation Service, I think is what it stands for. If you're not familiar, we basically have staff that kind of are 50-50 between the two groups, and they have a number of resources. A huge percentage of Xerces Society's work is around agriculture and pollinators. So if you're looking for resources in that realm, you can definitely check out the Xerces Society website. I'll put a link to our pollinator program. It's broken down by types of habitat. So we have focus on like farmlands, roadsides, all that sort of stuff. So I'll put that in response to, I guess I'll just put it in the chat here. A link to the pollinator page. But yeah, if you are working with large scale habitat in agricultural areas, we definitely have a lot of staff with a lot of great resources to help.
Thank you so much, Laura. Ellie is wondering, do you have recommendations for rehabilitating landscapes that have been sprayed with pesticides, like to reduce chemical load in the soil and things like that?
That's a great question. And yeah, that's another one that feel free to send an email because, we have some resources that we can share. That's, more than what I can just kind of list. I will say that it really does depend on kind of knowing what pesticides were potentially sprayed. There's certain pesticides that do break down relatively quickly. So the best thing to do is just kind of wait for, a few weeks to a few months. For others that are more long-lived, depending on, there's some that will break down more quickly, in sunlight or with, exposure to oxygen and air. So doing things like kind of rotating the soil around so that, more of that pesticide is exposed. There's certain ones that certain microbes will eat, and kind of help break down. So it really ends up kind of depending a little bit on what the pesticide is and like what the site is, and what ability you have to kind of do some of these manipulations with the soil. But yeah, feel free to send an email for kind of more specific case study advice.
I just wanted to point out we are at an hour past the top of the hour. So thank you so much. If you need to jump off, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And thank you, Aaron, for a wonderful presentation and for your great answers. And everyone in the chat and Q&A, thank you so much for your thoughtful engagement and wonderful questions and insights. I really appreciate all of your expertise and just your dedication to pesticide reduction and pollinator habitat. And I really appreciate the community you've all helped us create. So I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll keep answering questions. But again, this will all be recorded and available on YouTube. So goodbye if you're heading out, and thank you again. Aaron, go ahead, and Carly, go ahead.
Yes, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have another question from Laura. Apparently, and I'm sure we haven't had a chance to see this yet, but Dr. Fauci released an article in the Washington Post today about mosquitoes. And so she's worried it's going to increase widespread aerial spraying against mosquitoes. She's in the New England region and first frost has not yet occurred there. But just in general, do you have any thoughts on IPM for mosquito management issues where mosquito-borne illness is a major concern?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Laura, and something that we definitely think about a lot. And I do want to stress that, disease concerns are really real, and we're very sensitive to that. I think that there's kind of two things that come to mind to kind of answer this question. And one is that, I do want to stress that we are, our stance is not to like never spray for mosquitoes. Like if there, is disease prevalence, if, the monitoring requires, the spraying of adulticides to manage that, obviously that's something that needs to be done. I think from our perspective, different municipal mosquito management districts kind of do things differently, and some might manage in more ecologically minded ways than others. So some, rely mostly on what's called adulticiding, or, spraying for these adult mosquitoes, which is a pretty short-term solution, right? It's going to kill the mosquitoes that are actively flying, but mosquitoes are able to, lay 200 eggs at a time, and a body of water as small as the amount they can fit in a bottle cap, and they can reproduce in 8 to 10 days. So it's one of those things where if all you're doing is spraying for adult mosquitoes, you're constantly kind of putting these pulses of insecticides out into the to the landscape, and the long-term kind of chronic impact on that on pollinators and other beneficial insects isn't super well known. And meanwhile, there's municipal control districts. Boulder, Colorado is a great example of one that really does things in an ecologically minded way, where they're mostly monitoring for the larval mosquitoes in bodies of water around town, and they're only treating when the disease prevalence and the prevalence of the disease carrying mosquitoes, because there are all sorts of mosquitoes that don't actually even vector any of these diseases. They're nuisances. They bite you, but they don't transmit disease. So just because there's mosquitoes doesn't mean that there's a disease risk. So monitoring for the mosquito species as well as the disease, and when that starts hitting at a level of, a kind of a threshold level, then using treatments, using more targeted larvicides. Those are the ones that kill those larval mosquitoes, and which, has a much less chance of kind of non-target impacts, especially to pollinators. Doing that is a great way to start, control of these mosquito populations, reducing disease prevalence without having to spray, these kind of more broadly toxic adulticides. So again, we're not saying that this is not a concern. We would just encourage and are trying to provide resources for people to talk to their, municipal controlled districts, kind of see what their management strategies is. Another thing that comes to mind too is that, the number one way to reduce mosquito populations is what's called source reduction, which is just eliminating standing water, because that's what mosquitoes need to reproduce. They can't reproduce in moving water. So, on a personal level, making sure that you don't have standing water in like clogged gutters or an empty flower pot and a bucket, things like that. But also a good municipal control district will be going around doing education to community members, because you can do things on your own property, but since mosquitoes are great flyers, it doesn't really matter if the person across the fence on either side has a bunch of standing water and there's mosquito populations. Municipal control districts will also look for places kind of in more common areas like roadside ditches, places like that where there might be standing water, and either treat those or treat them with a larvicide or something. So this is a really long-winded answer to your question to say it's something we definitely think about, but I think that there are ways to kind of address these disease concerns without defaulting just straight to lots of aerial spraying, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. I think that one can tend to be a more controversial one, at least for some folks, and can sometimes be a tougher one to answer. So really appreciate your insight on that. We are getting down to the last few questions here. A couple more are filtering in. Courtney had another one kind of for the group.
Before we, just real quick, I just wanted to say, I'm going to put in the chat the Xerces Society's mosquito management resources, especially the ecologically sound mosquito management in wetlands and the how to help your community create an effective mosquito management plan. Those two resources are free on this website, this webpage, and they're really wonderful, especially the one about creating a community plan. It's just so excellent. It has everything from suggested letters to the editor sort of style thing, how to create a campaign, all these tools to help you communicate no matter where you are in your community, whether you're an official or a resident. But check it out. Lots of thoughtful resources there.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That's a great point. Some really great resources.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. So Courtney's is more directed at the group again. So if you want to answer in the chat while we move on to the next question, she's wondering how people manage Canada geese. We use dogs to scare or irritate the geese, but they tend to return quickly. Does anybody have luck with geese deterrents? So if you either want to raise your hand or put that in the chat, and we will move on. Ellen is asking, are organic sprays for mosquito reduction okay? Along the mosquito lines.
That's a great question. So lots of times so I do want to note that often there is misleading marketing by mosquito control companies where they'll kind of tout their applications as being derived from flowers. They might not use the term organic, talking about those toxic pyrethroids because they're related to pyrethrins, which are naturally derived from flowers, from chrysanthemum flowers, still very highly toxic, but then pyrethroids are these synthetic versions that are more long-lasting and even more toxic. So I do want to caution that sometimes they'll use a kind of a phrase, and I've had this happen when pest control companies have come around to our house. They say, our stuff's just derived from flowers, and then you look into it more deeply and it's synthetic pyrethroids. But for the ones that are truly like they'll use essential oil sprays, for example. Essential oils are less toxic than pyrethroids for sure, but because they're not subjected to the EPA's kind of oversight, the things that we do know about them are kind of collected from kind of a hodgepodge array of studies, and we know that there is some toxicity to larval bees from some of these essential oil products, and they also serve as a deterrent. So they might deter mosquitoes potentially, but they also will, if they're applied to a flowering plant, will likely deter bee visitation for a couple days. So I think it's one of those things where the efficacy on both ends is probably or I should say the efficacy on a mosquito repellent or mosquito killing end is a little bit more questionable. And then there still may be kind of non-target effects from these organic sprays, but in general they will be much less toxic than a pyrethroid spray or something like that. So
okay, and this next question is kind of directly related to that. You're talking about how essential oils can be or are less damaging than pyrethroids. This person's asking when herbicides, Karen is asking, when herbicides are needed for invasive plant control as a last resort, is there any type of rating system or levels of potential non-lethal impacts to pollinators for chemical selection available to folks?
yeah, that's a great question, and one that isn't easy to answer because unfortunately the literature on the non-target impacts of herbicides to beneficial insects isn't very robust. So there's glyphosate is often kind of vilified, but that's not necessarily because glyphosate is more toxic than some of these other herbicides. It's because there's just been more research done on glyphosate, so we found some more sublethal effects and things like that. So unfortunately, it's not as easy as just being like, oh, here's a list of the least and most toxic herbicides. There are a few that are more toxic, and we do know that, but a lot of it ends up being really specific to the location in the plant, and there's certain herbicides that are going to be more effective on a certain type of plant than others. So it's hard to kind of have a broad suggestion. I think what we kind of generally talk about when we talk about herbicide use is, and again, I see Kelvin's question here. It kind of addresses this as well. We because of those things that we were talking about, where there's not necessarily like, oh, these are recommended herbicides. We recommend using, if you have to use herbicides as a last resort, or potentially in a more restoration context, as Kelvin's question refers to. Lots of times, okay, if you have site prep, the best thing to do is to use an herbicide just to really make sure the site is ready to go. You can put native plantings in, and you're not going to have to constantly deal with weed pressure in subsequent years. If that's the case, trying to make sure you're using, again, the most targeted spray. So if you can use some sort of cut stump application, or very local spray, so you're not just broadcast spraying these chemicals across the entire site, trying to make sure that those application methods reduce pollinator risk. That's definitely one of the things we suggest. If you do have a specific question about a specific invasive plant, you can feel free to send us an email, and even if we don't know the answer, maybe we can connect you with a resource who might know the answer. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not as easy as just saying like, oh, herbicide X, Y, and Z are the go-tos, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Getting 2 questions with 1 answer there. Appreciate it. And Kelvin says thank you in the chat. So we're down to our last couple. So if folks, want to raise their hands or have anything else that they want to get into the Q&A, now is the time. This one, I'm not sure if it's so much in your wheelhouse, Aaron. It's another kind of specific one, but someone is wondering if ducks or frogs are used in the agricultural field for pest control.
Not that I know of intentionally. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen somewhere. I think that we talk about the term biological control as these organisms that eat or kill pest insects being used to help control pests, right? And there's one type of biocontrol that's classical biocontrol, which means you're actively releasing those organisms to eat the pests. But then something that we really promote is conservation biocontrol, which is just trying to make sure you have habitat in your yard, in your community, in your bee city, in your agricultural field, if it's an agricultural context, like this question is. And then by having that habitat, whether it's interspersed within the crops or around the margins of the field, you'll have a population of beneficial organisms that will then eat pests. So I could see frogs and ducks potentially, if you have great habitat, going out into these areas and providing some degree of pest control. But I haven't heard of people releasing like many ducks into an agricultural area to reduce pests. But maybe it has happened somewhere.
I think that Jason jumped off. Thank you for that last answer, Aaron. We might need more context for this one. I think that Jason jumped off, but it was back when you were talking about the study, and he asked, how about active ingredients? I'm going to murder this pronunciation, but pelargonic acid, 57% as an herbicide.
Oh, yeah, so that's kind of a tricky one. So, people are always kind of looking for, like a glyphosate replacement, for example, ways to manage weeds without using some of these more conventional herbicides, and using acids or like horticultural vinegars, things like that, or one solution that people use. I do want to caution that just because it's not glyphosate, or it is an kind of an acid acidic vinegar or something like that, doesn't mean it's necessarily has no non-target impacts, right? It might kill the plant, but if something like this example is 57% acid, or some of these horticultural vinegars, for example, are like 40% acid, they still may be pretty toxic to the soil community, or the soil biota in the soil, and the insect community on these plants, things like that. So again, I don't think there's kind of a magic solution by using some of these other products. Again, trying to do some of those non-chemical management methods first, doing prevention to try to keep the weeds from even popping up. Obviously doing hand pulling, even with some of the more sophisticated weeding tools that make hand pulling way easier and less taxing, would be a great first way to go. But then if you do feel like you have to use a chemical method, even if it is something just like horticultural vinegar or one of these acid products, really trying to limit that application just to the target plant, so that you're not having these potential non-target impacts. Because again, you think about an acid being poured onto you, or an insect or something, it's not gonna be great. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers that question.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aaron. And I did see just a few specific regional or questions about specific invasives in the chat. So again, you said that those can be directed to pesticides@xerces.org.
Yeah, if we don't have the answer, we can try and help connect you with who might know the answer. But yeah, we might have, some solutions for you.
Okay.
And
Great.
I just wanted to, I saw a couple people ask about when they should be presenting their IPM plan to Bee City. That is something that's due ideally within the first couple years of your certification. We understand if you've never had an IPM plan for your community, it may take more time. I kind of think of them as creating a strategic plan or a comprehensive plan, where it may take a year or so, depending on the size of your community, the key players. So certainly we'd like to see an IPM plan within your first reporting year if possible, but if it takes a few more years, we understand. And if you need help reviewing your IPM plan before you submit it, you're welcome to share it. You can email Bee City or the pesticide team. That's beecityusa@xerces.org, or pesticides@xerces.org, and we can provide feedback on your IPM plan and let you know if there's some tweaks we can suggest. But hopefully this IPM toolkit will provide a lot of that guidance for you, so you can kind of self-review and kind of do a self-service through the creation or improvement of your community's IPM plan.
Great.
Yeah.
And
Right.
again, this is being recorded and it's going to be posted up on the Xerces Society YouTube channel under the Bee City playlist within a few days.
Yeah, all right. Well, I guess that is everything. So thank you so much once again, Aaron and Carly and Matthew and everyone who joined us today. It was really wonderful to have such a strong turnout. We've had over 170 attendees, and I know we'll get a lot more views on YouTube. So again, this is publicly available, and we encourage you all to share these resources in your community. And we hope you find it helpful. And thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.